All right, friends and comrades, welcome back to the Archimedean Point. I'm your host, Daniel Tutt. With me, as always, is my good friend, Conrad Hamilton. And today we want to discuss Orientalism, the Marxist critique of Orientalism, issues of Islamophobia, Middle East politics, and socialism in America. Uh, Part of this is inspired by two pieces of writing that Conrad and I have both recently produced. First for myself, and then I'll have Conrad talk about a piece that he's recently written on the Disney film Aladdin and the framework of Orientalism as developed by Edward Said, which is a very fascinating piece, which I'll invite you to talk about in a moment, Conrad. But I recently wrote the preface for The Sword in the Neck, a forthcoming book coming out on November 21st with Iskra Books by Yanis Iqbal. And this is actually a book about Western philosophers' response to October 7th and to the Gaza genocide. And in my piece, I basically try to reintroduce the stakes of Frantz Fanon's critique of colonialism, the question of revolutionary violence, and I discuss a whole range of issues that Yanis brings up in his text. Much of which is actually connected to Conrad's recent piece on Aladdin, precisely in the sense of how we understand the colonial mode of production and how we understand the type of subordination of colonialism in relationship to capitalist modes of production. So that's our agenda for the Archimedean Point. This is our attempt at conjunctural analysis. So we often talk about our own work, but we also try to sort of weave in an analysis of contemporary events and issues in our conversation. There's a great playlist for the past 3 episodes on the YouTube channel. So please sign up on Patreon to get early access to these discussions. Obviously, Conrad and I recently contributed to Flowers for Marx, and Conrad is sort of well known in the Emancipations Network. He's led 2 study groups with us as well. So welcome to the program, Conrad. How are you first off?
Oh, not too bad. Not too bad. Just I got my Lakers shirt on as a reference. It's my LeBron as a reference to Drew because I think he said that a real Marxist science would be like how LeBron sees where the ball is on the court. Spinoza's third kind of knowledge is the synchronic, as Althusser says. So this is my, I didn't know you could do that with theoretical references, but I'm doing that tonight. I have to collect my endorsement money later.
Yeah, but this this is
Um,
this is like supra-sensible irrationalist vitalist epistemology where you're like the Superman, you can see the future and so on. Which is I mean interesting point, but I suppose there's some it's a nice metaphor. Um but yes, we so okay, so all right.
Well, but to be
Aladdin.
clear, but to be clear about that, he's taking after. I mean, yes, there is that dimension to it, which is a little bit inflated, but also like, for someone like Spinoza, it's not a matter of, being able to see all of the causal determinations of everything. It's the fact that, if you could know everything, there would be no contingency anymore, right? So it's more of a theoretical postulate in that sense,
Yeah.
but anyway, just unleading for you.
No, that's excellent. Okay. So, as comrades will know, in past Archimedean points, we've talked about this theme of discrimination, of otherization, of racism. And we've tried to, I think, in our social formation of the far right episode, for example, we talked a lot about what the kind of Marxist contribution to understanding racism is all about and the kind of deficiency in liberal understandings of discrimination that sort of miss out on the kind of materialist dimension or even the social reproductive dimension of racism. And I feel that today we're going to be touching on themes of racism, but again, from a slightly different vantage point. And I want to maybe begin by introducing the framework of Orientalism as developed by Edward Said, I think in 1979, or was it earlier?
It was 78. Is that right for the text?
Okay.
Yeah.
something late 70s.
Yeah.
Obviously, hugely influential framework, but one that is based on Michel Foucault's conception of history, but also based on a type of false binary. And maybe we could start with this false binary of Orientalism and why you see that as false. And what is the binary that it relies on, actually?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the first thing that has to be said about Orientalism is I think that it's a complex text to discuss from today's standpoint or to evaluate. Because it's very like it kind of came at the tail end, right, of all of these anti-colonial revolutions, right? We can talk about this cycle, with China and Algeria and Vietnam and so forth. So it's arriving at the end of that process. And I think it's clear that, the call for, the West to sort of reevaluate the kind of diminutive and derisory images that it's been producing, of the Orient, as it were, is a reflection of those successes. But I would argue that, on the other hand, there's also a kind of latent anti-Marxism that situates the text as also being part and parcel of I hesitate to say a counter-revolution, but a kind of victory of compradorism and the abandonment of a kind of global revolutionary project, by those states that had been relatively newly emancipated.
Right.
Because we know in many of these countries that you had, local elites kind of foisting themselves to power.
And that's what compradorism is. A
Yeah,
victory.
yeah,
Yeah.
local elites foisting
Right.
themselves to power and enriching themselves, while in
And
many
you're
cases,
talking about in former colonial lands, in the quote unquote global South. That's what you're referring to.
yeah, 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 yeah. Well, and it's funny, right? Because, it's not like this wasn't anticipated on some level. I mean, many people object to the PCF's position in the Algerian War, which was taken for strategic reasons as well, to not cause a civil war in France. But many people object to their position, according to which Algeria should have remained part of France, but been given total equal rights, and economic
Mhm.
equalization should have been pursued. But, the pretext of that position was basically that, if they become independent, it's going to be they're going to find themselves exploited within a ostensibly free global marketplace, which many countries did succumb to, right?
Which is
So,
why Samar Amin's theory of delinking was effectively opposed, was strategically opposed to that proposition. A lot of people forget that that was their position.
yeah, well, and a lot of people like Amin's thesis is really misread on several levels. Um, but a lot of people forget that he was how they take it dogmatically, and they forget that that was also the product of a certain time, and exactly that was happening. So even when he looks at, he calls for delinking, but even when he looks at China later, he has some reservations, but he can kind of understand their equivocal, what he calls relinking with the world market, because he says, like, now they're in a position where they actually have the political authority, where they can do this in a way that is conducive to the genuine improvement of living standards in their own country in a widespread way, which is very different than what it would have been had that political authority and infrastructure and all this not been consolidated through this kind of emergency state. And one of the last things, by the way, Amin wrote was, he called for a new international, right? And he said, like, now we're seeing that throughout the world, there's general proletarianization has made conditions in Ohio and Shenzhen more alike than they were when I first started writing. So I think people aren't so sensitive to all the shifts, right, within his work, because he is, like, as Althusser said, right? It's a conjunctural study as well.
And that
Right.
is actually incidentally reminds me of a problem that I find in some of the contemporary left, um, uncritical celebrations of contemporary China and its kind of model of state socialism, where the obvious risk, right, is to miss that precise continuity of proletarian condition in China and the United States, just as two examples. When it is so uncritically seen, or sort of you shelter that question, and
Hmm. Hmm.
putting aside the role of censorship on behalf of the state apparatus in China, like you see, I think there's a certain danger to that. Um, but anyways, okay. So we're slightly off track. Back to Orientalism
Yeah.
and
So
the
so
condition
Said
of it.
wrote this book, and all I
Well,
want to say about this book is that I think that I would call it one of these great kind of bad books, because you have these, right? Books that are uh, landmarks of a sort, right, or watersheds, but also have serious issues. So I think, one of the most conspicuous issues in, probably the most conspicuous issue in Orientalism is the way that Emin, um, so yeah, I think probably the biggest um, problem with this book in a way is that it's not clear the kind of operation that is being performed. Because we have this kind of pretension to be performing a sort of Foucauldian discourse analysis, which obviously was very fashionable at that point. And there's this remarkable array, a great erudition, right, of predominantly really Western texts that are surveyed in it. Um, but there's also this odd dimension because at times Said will say, well, Orientalism is something that emerged in the 18th century, right, as a corollary of imperialism, which makes sense, like as a materialist hypothesis, right? But then there's literally like another passage where he says, like even in the time of Homer, right, we see this, uh, you know, um, uh, Orientalist, anti-Asiatic, standpoint being cultivated. And this is like quite bizarre, right? Because at that level, what you're doing is you're just transforming, the Occident and the Orient into these kind of metaphysical solitudes, which are trans-historical. And you really lose sight of any kind of materialist analysis. So, and of course, it's funny to me because, you know, one of the most common reproaches of people who do different fields, such as in post-colonialism as well, who are anti-Marxist in orientation, is that Marxism traffics in grand narratives, and yet we find like a grand narrative that puts Marx, dwarfs anything we find in Marxism, right? In this, because like one thing you can say about Marxism in kind of a Hegelian vein is like you can dispute certain aspects of it, but there is an attempt to represent dialectical transformations, and the sort of telos that's being posited. There's a certain kind of immanence to the material conditions of a given society, which is most salient in the case of the analysis of capitalism. But I mean, this is like almost getting to like an Alexander Dugin level, right? When you're like, the Atlantic and the continental, and like, like, to do this. So that's not. I'm not saying that that's the entire character of Orientalism as a text, but that is one dimension of it. And Said tended to sort of disavow that because one thing he was critical of was the way that his work would sometimes get taken up, as a kind of means of advancing a kind of narrow narrow kind of post-colonial nationalist projects, rather than as the more sort of reflective discourse analysis standpoint. But in terms of the way it might lend itself to dubious forms of really capitalist nationalism, right, in the aftermath of the late 1970s, I mean, you can really see that dimension as also being latent to the text.
yeah, that's very interesting. One of the ways that this happens is the politicization of discourse and cultural symbols. And so, one of the things that the book that I wrote the preface to is very good on is this precise deficiency in Edward Said's general conception of politics, whereby you do have the politicization of cultural symbols and this kind of yeah, like you said, like a bourgeois nationalism emerges. And but what is this kind of binary? It's a kind of an ahistorical binary. And this binary is between the Occident and the Orient, but it almost seems to reinforce a kind of liberal conception of something almost immutable, like an immutable chasm, which then feeds into a kind of racialization paradigm that's very liberal. And I wanted to ask you about that. Like, what are the sort of deficiencies with this? with this paradigm, and like sort of what might a more historically materialist approach to the question of Islamophobic racism give us? Because I think this is the heart of the issue, right? Which is, I mean, we're seeing the justification vis-a-vis imperialism of a kind of persistent anti-Muslim, liberalism. And Islamophobia in the liberal worldview is so omnipresent that you really, it really has its own distinctive features, and it is very ubiquitous. It's very ubiquitous amongst elite liberals. It's very ubiquitous amongst the kind of populist right. It almost is what unites the two of them. I mean, we're seeing this very clearly with the Zoran Mamdani campaign right now, even though
Yeah.
it's unsuccessful. So I wanted to invite you to say something about the kind of Saidian sort of, and Said wrote a lot about Islamophobia, and he wrote a
Yeah.
lot about media depictions of Arabs. And you get into a weird double bind because on the one hand, you do have to do something about these violent and sort of racist caricatures of Arabs and Muslims on screen and television, while at the
Mhm.
same time rejecting some of the kind of more foundational analysis as idealist, or as, like I said, kind of politicizing this kind of the symbolic, a certain way that seems inadequate. And this will kind of dovetail into Aladdin as kind of like exemplary of a
Yeah.
very neo-Orientalist series of tropes and narratives.
Yeah. Yeah.
What
Well,
yeah,
I mean,
what would you say?
I think, when it comes to these issues, of course, we can acknowledge, the deleterious characters of a lot of the representation that we've witnessed and that we continue to witness. Islamophobia, as it were, being kind of a staple, of American political ideology, right? In no small part because of the power that some of these countries enjoy due to their resource monopolies, right? Um, but because if you look at it, like really, if you look at who the big bad guys are for the U.S., right? It's like Russians, Chinese, Arabs, right? So it's really like large countries that successfully delinked, and states that hold strong resource monopolies that can imperil the United States in that way. So it's obviously very interest focused. But when it comes to identifying, the historical character of systems of discrimination, I mean, this is part of the problem, and it's even a problem when we talk about, like, when we use a word as general as imperialism, and I think we've discussed this before, like, as if it are something that you can just apply throughout history. Like, you can only understand that in relation to the particular mode of production and how it relates to territories that it expands into, right? So that's the starting point, and that's also the starting point if you're trying to understand, how racism and discrimination function. I mean, I think one of the best, and I do talk about it in the text on the apostate fascism of Alexander Dugin. We're very critical of Dugin's work, not as some have dubiously asserted, it's not a pro Dugin piece, rather a Marxist critique of Dugin. But one thing I think we were talking about him in, and one thing that I think is very interesting about what he does is that when he talks about the character of ethnic discrimination in Russia, he relates it to the history of Russia's development. So he basically says, well, in the Tsarist era, right, you had like the expansion of this sort of tributary system, but it wasn't based on economic exploitation of the majority of the peoples into which the Russian Empire expanded. Rather, it was a kind of political domination, that was premised on the hegemony of the Orthodox Church. And then later with the foundation of the Soviet Union, you see a change in relations where money is actually flowing out of Moscow to those places, and where there's a lot of protections for minorities and so forth. But this is the point. What I like about it is it's a very concrete material analysis. And we can see the same kind of thing, right? When we look at Adolf Reed, right? Some of his critiques of Black Lives Matter as being asynchronous with the current political culture, right? Because what we're looking at is not, race as a kind of pure vector of discrimination, but rather the
Right.
racialization of class, right? So I think the antidote to this is to really situate things within their economic context.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's good. So let's situate Aladdin in its economic context. And I feel this will be a good way for us to sort of introduce a theory of the kind of modernity, of capitalism as modernity,
Hmm.
and the way that Aladdin functions as this kind of microcosmic myth of capital and its own expansion. But the way that you sort of outline Aladdin is very comprehensive, in the sense that what Aladdin is sort of providing is almost like a sort of the introduction of a particular form of individualism, which is the handmaiden of capitalist modernity. And what I find interesting about that movement, right, that like if capitalism necessitates the invention of a kind of traditionalist other, in a way, and I wonder if Said helps us actually get at this or not. In a way, it seems that where he might err is that he misses that precise periodization. He misses this sort of the distinctive shift that capitalist modernity introduces. And in your piece, you talk about merchant capital and how the kind of colonial context is subordinated to merchant capital, but then Aladdin um, is introducing a more modern form of capitalist mode of production. So why don't you just lay all of that out for us so we get a
Yeah,
better.
yeah. Well, I wouldn't say the colonial context. I'm talking about the Islamic Golden Age when I talk about merchant capital. That's sort of the focus of the text. Well, I think what I argue in the text, which was prepared for a conference called Reviving the Commons, and it's poised to be published in a, I'll have to go through some edits probably, but it's poised to be published for a Filipino journal called Critica Cultura. And is sort of a form of, really a kind of literary or cinematic study that deals heavily with some of the political themes we're describing. But I think one of the things that we have to appreciate is that, um, you know, there's a great piece by Faisal El-Assad in Borderlines, and he talks about the way that, if we look at the stories of Arabian Nights, right, that a lot of them, they appear to, allegorize the conditions of merchant capital within the Islamic Golden Age. And you had an amazing profusion of merchant capital in that time, right? Because if you look at, the Umayyads and the Abbasids, if you look at the territory that was unified, right, from kind of the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea, you created a sort of integrated commercial network. And there were different aspects to this, right? Um, you know, um, there were large scale estates, and there was kind of the Byzantine currency system in these different dimensions. But what it meant is like, what is merchant capital at the most basic level? And merchant capital is when you're, it's not productive in the sense that capitalism would be, but it's essentially, acquiring an asset in an environment where it's much more readily available and then reselling it in another one, right? And of course, um, you're going to gain, right, more than the cost of your journey is sort of the premise that it requires, right? So when you have the largest commercial network to date that had been assembled within that region, it really lent itself to the proliferation of wealth. And you had people, even within a single generation, who were becoming colossally rich, right? And of course, you had the caravans, you had all kinds of long distance journeys, and all of this. And it's interesting to pose the question, like historically, of why that didn't congeal into a capitalist um, style of organization. And there are different explanations that are put forth for this. One that Faisal al-Assad, as well as he's drawing from Javier Spinazzi, is A Brief History of Commercial Capitalism. One explanation that they discuss is that you didn't have the integration of capitalists into the state in the same way that you had in Europe, right? So in Europe, you had things like, joint stock ventures being backed by states, the Commenda, even the Crusades could be seen as an early form of this. And this begins to define the spirit of early colonial capitalism, right? One of our great controversies in Marxism being whether you can speak legitimately of a pre-industrial capitalism, right? But if we're going to do that, right, what I think is characteristic of it is that You see this even with, the fur traders and everything in New France in Canada, but that colonialism and conquest were being pursued at the behest of capital and to enrich capital, right? Whereas you had a different relationship within the Islamic Golden Age, right? Because you might conquer a place and there might be subsidiary benefits that are accrued to capitalists, but the principal reasoning would have been much of what we would have seen throughout history prior to that, which is the expansion of a tributary network, right? And actually, it's interesting about this too, because Samir Amin, when he's talking about, I think in Unequal Exchange, he talks briefly about the Islamic Golden Age, and he actually refers to it as a commercial tributary mode of production or social formation. So it had different elements, right? Again, I think one thing, and it's actually very interesting in the stories in Arabian Nights, because you have long distance voyages, you have magic that could be taken at a certain level as allegorizing, the powers, right, that are being accrued to people through this process of exchange. And you also have another dimension, which Faisal al-Assad draws attention to, which is that a lot of these stories, including Aladdin, which obviously Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp was not in the original Arabian Nights. It was told to Antoine Galland by the Syrian storyteller Hamid Dayeb. But in a lot of these stories, you see this sort of synthesis of monarchy and the commercial class. You're right. So one thing that Faisal al-Assad that he sees in these stories, like Arabian, the stories of Arabian Nights, is he sees that there's a kind of you know unfulfilled wish for the integration of the commercial class with the state, which was never achieved in the Islamic Golden Age. Now, to be clear, monarchs in that period would often intentionally host large markets, right? This relates to the centrality of the marketplace, which we see visualized within Aladdin as well. But they did so, in order to collect taxes, essentially. But it wasn't that their fundamental sovereignty, right, was synthetic in that way. So there we find a strong difference with Europe. And actually, by the way, there were limited forms of manufacturing as well, which I found quite fascinating. So it just goes to show that you can never draw, a hard line between this and that. But I think from this prism, I mean, I decided in this essay, A Whole New World, Disney's Aladdin and the Transformation of Social Reality, or the Remaking of Social Reality. I took on this story because it's one that, is so. Aladdin is really almost like the preeminent work of sort of pop-Orientalism of its time. And there was another essay I read on, and what it was pointing out is that if you look at even like the core influences that the creators of the film cited, right? I think 3 of the 4 were not, actually, cultural objects from that era. They were Western representations, right? So it's very much in this mode. But I think what's really, really important to understand is the way that, what Disney, the challenge they're faced with, and it's one that is historical in terms of the reception of the Aladdin story. And I can get into that in a minute. But the basic challenge that they're faced with is, how do you take this story, right, which is really about, again, merchant capital. It's an allegory for this kind of mode of production or social formation. How do you take that and make it a story about capitalism, right? And I think there are different ways in which that's accomplished, right? I think the profound importance of the genie as a character owes a great deal to the way that there's this sort of inexhaustible postmodern energy associated with Robin Williams' performance. And I love the fact that apparently, when Robin Williams performed, he would be just soaked in sweat at the end of every, which reminds me of a quote by Marx, right? Capital arrives soaked in sweat and blood, I think he says. But the genie, it's remarkable, right? In the sense that, he, if you look at the original story, what we see is Aladdin sort of, the genie produces things, right? He produces silver plates, right? He produces like a palace. And actually, there's 2 genies in the original story. There's the genie of the ring and the genie of the lamp. But there are a few things that make the genie different. in the Disney version. And one is that he also melts down time, and not just in the sense of the condensation of long distance voyages or the sort of simple process of teleportation, in the sense that he inhabits and impersonates characters from contemporary pop culture, right, in a way that makes the film sort of willfully postmodern in a kind of Jamesonian sense. So he's Arnold Schwarzenegger striking like a garish bodybuilder's pose. He's Cab Calloway dancing the jive. Capitalist history sort of becomes condensed into his character. And I think here it would be interesting, right, to talk about even, I think if you look at the way Nick Land has read Deleuze on this, right, because one of the things that Nick Land talks about is the way that if you think about time in relation to entropy, right? In a way, we're reversing this process of decay, right? Whenever if we were to construct a building, right? We're reversing the kind of entropic process, right? And one of the things he toys with Deleuze's analysis of time, and I think in Deleuze's third synthesis of time, you could almost understand it like a, it's like when you take it's like a needle going in you have like a needle on a record player, and then if you were to kind of bump the needle, it kind of restarts in another direction, right? So you have time that's constantly sort of being rearranged, right? And obviously this is something that Nick Lands relates to the capitalist mode of production, right? Like it's not a kind of pagan, right, cyclic conception of time, right? It's a conception of time that is subject to these dramatic alterations, right? So I think there are a lot of interesting ways to read that. And it's interesting to me, like even at the level of who's telling the story, because one thing that's interesting, Aladdin begins, and there's a peddler, if anyone remembers the beginning of the first film, and he's selling these sort of junky wares, right? And he's clad in blue. He has a kind of pop-up shop from his camel, and the in first person, the viewer begins to look away, and then he rushes over, right, to arrest the movement away of the first person. And he says, "Oh, I can see you only want the finest things," right? And then he reveals this old oil lamp, and he says, "It may seem like nothing, right? But it once changed the course of a young man's life." And he basically says that the things that, as is so often the case, the things that seem the most austere or the simplest, right, contain this sort of inner wonder. And I think this, in addition to being a kind of clear allegory for the power of capital, in the sense that it's not the material goods generated by the genie of the story. It's a kind of capacity to transform social reality. One really interesting thing about the scene is that a lot of people have long suspected that the character, the peddler at the beginning, was actually voiced by Robin Williams. People had long suspected that that was the genie. And some years later, I think in 2019 or something, one of the directors, he did an interview and he said, yes, indeed, that was. So then in this case, right, there's this whole, you could almost analogize it to this sort of Zizekian reading of Hegel, right, as a sort of retroactively constructed teleology rather than like a pure, abstract or deterministic teleology, right? It actually becomes like a story told from the standpoint of capital. Potentially just like a lie created in order to sell, some crappy piece of goods, right?
No, that's very good. It's almost the I was wondering as you were saying that where primitive accumulation might fall within this allegory. On the one hand, on the other hand, there's this question of the eventual kind of class conflict portrayed in the film, which I find super interesting because in a way it is a class conflict which pits the importation of the kind of lower class hero who is now has the technology of capital in his self-becoming against Oriental despotism. And then, of course, that Oriental despotism in the early 90s was sort of flamboyant and it was very kind of Islamophobic.
Yeah.
But then you have a kind of more woke Will Smith version of Oriental despotism where it's like expunged
Yeah.
and it's gone. And that's very odd, but that's like a separate issue. But I'm curious though, like in the wider Aladdin presentation, where is primitive accumulation?
Yeah, I mean, so it wouldn't be primitive accumulation in the sense that, if we're talking about like the colonial frontier of Canada or something like that, right? Because we're
Right.
talking about, but nevertheless, right, it has to
Yeah,
exist
well,
in.
like, yeah, like exactly. Like where are like the dispossession of the peasantry, enclosures,
Yeah,
proletariatization? None of that seems to be quite portrayed. Rather, what we get is a kind of good versus evil of the Oriental despotist machine or class power of the monarchy versus which okay then the mode of production there is as you say merchant capital, and then the new hero who's introducing the personification of capital is somehow fighting against them um through his love affair with Jasmine. So I'm curious like how. Yeah,
yeah.
okay, sorry. So what were you gonna say about that? Because that to me would be essential.
Well, about this, like, it's like actually, it's really interesting you talk about primitive accumulation, because the first thing you see in the movie, if I remember properly, you see the one of the first things anyway. You see Jafar perched on a dune, on a horse, and he is conversing with. There's the parrot Iago, and he's conversing with this guy Gassim, and Gassim has given him the sort of scarab, which, by the way, symbolically means a sort of rebirth, which I think is very interesting in this context. But the scarab is going to lead the way, right, to the Cave of Wonders. And one of the first things that Gassim says is, I had to cut a few throats to get it, right?
Right.
So this is already telling us something,
Right.
right? And really, it's about what we're seeing here is it's like, again, if we're talking about class allegory, I really think that Jafar is a kind of um, he's a kind of proto bourgeois of the absolutist type. You know,
Right.
we could talk about the Prussian Junkers or kind of the Japanese Meiji dynasty at this stage. And what he understands is that gold, diamonds, whatever, it doesn't matter, right? Like if I can get the genie, I can get the power to transform social reality,
Exactly.
and none of that
Exactly.
will matter, right? So he's scheming as to how to um, thrust himself ahead, and but there's a problem here, right? Which is that capital needs labor, right? So
Right.
when he tries to enter, right, it says find the one who's the diamond in the rough, right? And this is actually interesting because this whole idea of a kind of moral predestination is entirely a European construct, and I'll get into that maybe a little bit later.
That's right, because if I'm not mistaken, the father of Jasmine, the king, is actually ambivalent, is morally ambivalent between capital and merchant capital, or is morally ambivalent between like the old ancien regime and like what Aladdin represents, right? And Jasmine's like, you can trust, you can trust the new, like
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
hang
yeah, and there's
don't hang on
yeah,
to
and
the
there's this
old.
sort of post-feminist, yeah, like kind of silliness in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
movie
but
as
but
well.
but the aristocrat is kind of indifferent, which I think is very it's like a very nice Losurdo point, right? Which is like
Just like whatever. Yeah, yeah, it's funny.
no, 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 no,
No,
no,
but
but like the capital is kind of indifferent to aristocratic rule in some sense, like
well,
or rather
a
that it
funny
remains.
fact about yeah, a funny fact about that is that in the original story by I think it's generally thought that in the original story by Diab, the monarch would have been portrayed as quite a bit more severe. So there's a scene where because in the original story, Aladdin wishes to transport the princess, who's has a long name that I forget, but definitely isn't Jasmine. He wishes to transport her to his bedroom for successive nights in a row, and she's sort of traumatized, and she kind of goes into a state of mutism. And at one point, the king he says, "Well, I'll just like cut your head off, basically, if you don't tell me the." But it's odd because there are other passages in it where they say, "Oh, the king is so nice, he's so benevolent." So I think if you look at Antoine Golan, the French guy who's responsible for what becomes the international version of Arabian Nights, he was sort of on the moderne side of the debate of the ancien versus moderne in France. Who's close to people like Charles Perrault. So these people that basically believe that you should be revising, fairy tales and so on to bring them up to date, with the sort of royalism, and morality of the Europe of that time. And then there were other people who insisted on the integrity of the original stories, which maybe is an odd parallel to our current aesthetic debates that we're experiencing in terms of the need to change everything from the past. But with that digression said, no, I mean, so I think what we really have here, the problem is that capital needs labor, right? So, you have to seek out the diamond in the rough, right? And in a pre-capitalist context, this turns out to be not someone who is proletarianized, right? They're sort of a lumpen proletariat, right? And there's always a beautiful scene I think that people miss early on in that movie because Aladdin's trying to get away from the guards and he jumps onto a carpet and the carpet just goes down and it's kind of a foreshadowing. Like there's no social mobility or escalation. And it doesn't just go down. It goes down into like an alley where he sees two poor children actually sifting through
Right.
the garbage, and then he gives them the loaf of bread that he stole. So we know that he's really a good person. Okay.
Right.
But so the princess tries to escape the confines of this sort of feudal idyllic patriarchal relations, as Marx says. And she's eventually captured, and then Aladdin is put in prison. And then Jafar springs him from prison, right? Because he had seen through in this kind of real mulligan, he'd seen through his magic, whatever, that this is the guy. And then brings him out there. And it's actually very interesting, even when they get to the cave, because what does Jafar say to Aladdin? He says, touch nothing but the lamp. Right. And it's already like this kind of, and actually this is interesting because this is in the original story, but it would make sense in relation perhaps to some of the doctrines regarding political economy that are already calcified in the Islamic Golden Age. But he says, touch nothing but the lamp. Well, this almost is like Adam Smith, like investment and expense, right? It's like, it's not the gold, right? Like it's not the fancy stuff. It's like you have to hold out, right? Capital requires this sort of restraint, right? So, and then you have these kind of, twists and turns, obviously, throughout the narrative. I always find it really, really interesting because if you look at that whole new world, this, and if you actually look at what you see there, you see they fly through ancient Egypt, then you see like the Parthenon, and then they fly by, I think it's like, what is it, Monopsonos? I'm trying to get the pronunciation right, but it's like, but it's more like something you'd see in like an 18th century French park, the one that they coast by. So, it's almost like this whole new world, right? If you look at the mise en scene, it's almost like a kind of Western, trajectory this way, which speaks to one of the issues that we're dealing with here, right? Which is, how do you allegorize, the modernity of a place without it becoming effectively Eurocentric, right? I mean, there were many critics of Aladdin. One thing they often said is that it's interesting that a lot of the stock characters and villains look so ethnicized, whereas Aladdin and Jasmine look like Barbie and Ken with conspicuous suntans.
Right.
Exactly. You have this clearly sort of Eurocentric dimension. Though I did hear that, funnily enough, I think one of the heads of Disney, he defended the representation of the stock characters on the grounds that they were all based on staff at Disney. But anyway, okay. And he was like, a lot of people are complaining about this, but he was like, we put out a movie, we put out non-white heroes, and they're great icons for everybody. And that's what everyone's missing about this. But anyway, so the
but that problem is gone from the Will Smith rendition, isn't it? because
Well, it's
or
toned down. I mean, I don't think you
tone
can
down.
completely erase. I don't want to talk too much about that because it's too low for me to talk about really. But no, but they did. They had like all of these like cultural consultants and everything to try to deal with some of these issues. So yeah, they do cast non-white actors and so forth. So that particular
Yeah,
issue
yeah.
is not quite as salient. I do
But that
love.
actually is that actually is the point though, right? Which is like, in We Have Never Been Woke, Musab Al-Gharbi argues that wokeism was initiated by a class of people that he refers to as symbolic capitalists.
Yeah,
And this is very interesting because if we go back to some of the kind of inbuilt prescriptions of Saidian Orientalism and its limitations being about discourse, representation, symbolism, well, you could see in a way that the natural outcome of that would be the hiring of a whole wing of, symbolic capitalists to effectively um, uh, improve the authenticity, quote unquote, of the portrayals of within Aladdin. And there's something about that that I don't know how it sits with you, but it feels to me. I mean, we saw this with the Little Mermaid as well.
yeah,
Um, it feels to me like this. In a way, it's something that is almost never capable of fully achieving the aims that it sets out. Like, and I wanted to ask you why that might be the case. In other words, why is it that we can never sort of arrive at a sort of representation that would be, or maybe we can. I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but like a representation that would sort of satisfy. Like, what are the kind of limits of this
yeah.
trope?
I mean, I
Does
don't
that make sense?
consider,
Like,
to be clear, like I don't consider capitalism like necessarily fixed with respect to, who is exploiting and who is exploited. But I do think there's a real history of its historical nucleus and where it emanates from. And I think that, we've seen plenty of changes. I mean, when Southern Italians first arrived in the United States, like they weren't considered white, right? Like, so you see these transformations in the conception of identity that take place. And actually, this is something some of the critics of the film have also talked about, right? How Aladdin and Jasmine are sort of symbolically white in a sense, right?
yeah,
But you also risk falling into a kind of trap here, right? Because some of the critics will also say, you know, well, the film, it demonizes Islamic law, and it's like, well, I don't know if that's something we should be glorifying either, right? And in
well,
any
that's
case, like,
actually that's actually part of the binary. So I think I
yeah,
think I think you just hit at my problem, which is this binary logic also invites either you are phobic or you are philiac. Either you
yeah.
love Islam or there's no room for like a kind of it's very spectrum based and it's very much a binary logic, which elicits a type of love hate or this kind of mania. It's very mania based. Maybe that's the problem, right? Which is that it's like it's forcing an adhesion to a binary, which is like a false binary ultimately.
Well, also
Precisely. Yeah.
when they talk about these things like Islam, they always implicitly are discussing progressive instantiations of it, which do exist, but those have not been the seed of social energies of Islam, right? Over the past several decades or since the Six Days War, or however you want to situate it. So, it's like there's a certain kind of social unreality that kicks in at that level. Whereas, if you read actual leftist commentators, in the Middle East, a lot of them are extremely hostile toward these things, and not because they're a priori hostile towards like Islam as some kind of general cultural basis or whatever, but because they're very conscious of the fact that this is, become in many instances like an extremely chauvinistic doctrine that's based on sort of imaginary representations of history, right? That's it's like it wouldn't even, like what kind of authenticity is this suggestive of? So I think, and this is kind of gets at it, right? I think part of the problem of Aladdin, in a way, is the question of how do you articulate an emancipatory conception of non-Western modernity, that doesn't succumb to either Eurocentrism on one side, right, or this sort of naive romanticization of cultural authenticity on the other side, right? But I want to, by the way, and one thing I didn't draw attention to that I really should, I think it's really, really important to stress kind of like the status of, um, you know, of I think it's very important to stress the way that the genie represents capital in this equation, in a manner quite different. So if I pull this up, one second. Um, uh, So, I mean, even if we look at the lyrics here, right? Like, this is like how Robin Williams begins the song Friend Like Me, which I always think is, in a sense, like the most indicative of this within the movie. He says, well, Ali Baba had them 40 thieves, Shizarad had 1,000 tales. But master, you're in luck, because up your sleeves, you've got a brand of magic that never fails. You've got some power in your corner now, some heavy ammunition in your camp. You got some punch, pizzazz, Yahoo and how. See, all you got to do is rub that lamp. And I'll say, Mr. Aladdin, sir, what will your pleasure be? Let me take your order, jot it down. You ain't never had a friend like me. Life is your restaurant, and I'm your maitre d'. Come on, whisper what it is you want. You ain't never had a friend like me. And I think when you look at this, it's all clear, right? A brand of magic, that never fails. It's like a mom and pop shop, put it a
Mhm.
business.
Mhm.
Scissorad's a mom and pop shop, put it a business by Amazon or something,
Mhm.
and he's saying like, well, in the feudal patriarchal idyllic relations, you had these things, but you ain't never seen this, right? Heavy ammunition in your camp, right? So it's like this is like martial and violent as well. Um, so it's really quite instructive on that level. But I think it's also a very important question to ask about the subjective dimension of it, because I already said this. You'd have to trace, and I do in the essay, I trace sort of like the different um, receptions of it. And, it's usually attributed first to Antoine Galland, but later to subsequent European authors that they felt this compulsion to make Aladdin into this kind of moral person. And, I think if you were trying to understand this, and this is what makes, by the way, the Disney version partly so different. I mean, in the original story, Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp, Aladdin kind of becomes more worldly and courageous, but he doesn't become more moral, as it were. Like that's kind of an invention of the European reception. And I think it's interesting to discuss this because, I think that we have to talk about, of course, Marx says that, Christianity is, I think he refers to it as kind of the ideal religion of capitalism, particularly in its more, secular, more abstract forms, right? Like Protestantism and deism and so forth. But I think we have to ask ourselves why this is. And I think one thing that is true of, it's sort of like the concept of, um, you know, personhood embodied within like the Trinity, right? Sort of becomes diffused to all of these kind of, corporate entities, right? And that becomes part of the basis of the sort of organization of capitalism within Europe. And ultimately, I think that this idea that because the genie in this, his goal isn't just to, make Aladdin succeed or anything like this, it's to actuate his true self, right? To bring forth this kind of inner authenticity. So it's an index to the actual subjective transformation of society that has to occur, right? For capitalism to take hold. But I think you could draw certain parallels, right? So if we look at, someone like Adam Smith, if we look at the theory of moral sentiments, right? It's very interesting, as well as Wealth of Nations. It's very interesting because in a way, what he does is he shifts the agency of God onto man while maintaining God as a kind of premise, right? Because God's sort of the cosmic watchmaker who sets everything in motion. But but this sort of agential dimension or causal dimension is shifted to humans, right? So we see this in a theory of moral sentiments, where you have this idea that, well, um, you know, okay, um, it's like people, yes, people are atomistic by nature, but what we're able to do is we're able to exercise sympathy, what might be more better understood as empathy in today's terms, right? Where we kind of put ourselves in the place of another person, right? And it's through this process of mirroring, right, that we're able to cultivate, this sort of reciprocity among small groups of people. But Smith basically says, like, well, but the problem is that, we're not eligible to feel that for the entire world, right? Most men, their concern ends at their community, even goes so far as to say their country, right? But fortunately, God being who he is, he's put people all over the world, who experience this vis-a-vis others, right? Which will thereby kind of ensure that, everyone will be okay. Okay.
That's like
Uh,
the reminds me of the Age of Aquarius. I don't know if you remember
yeah.
this from the 60s. It's like this mystical theory that there will come an age, a generation of people who will be so their interior life will have so much universal compassion that they will become the catalyst for a new like global transformation of consciousness and spirituality and bring a kind of reign of eternal global peace. And that was like the Age of Aquarius is kind of this thing that a lot of boomers actually used to talk about. Like it's, I mean, no, really cockamamie kind of
Yeah.
stuff,
Yeah.
but your crackpot sort of theory. I mean, you have to sort of adore its innocence or its naivete in a certain way. But yeah, I
Well,
feel that like,
you see it in something like Star Trek. It's the way that this sort of this post-capitalist potential
yeah,
was treated as almost like an inner potential of humans,
hmm hmm
in their totality. But the problem with this is like it's already beginning to forget the specificity of class relations in a way that is going to prove damaging in subsequent years. I
hmm
mean, I think now we can look back at it very nostalgically because at the very least those ends are accepted in a sense, which would make it quite unlike, even the dystopic science fiction we see as early as,
Well,
Alien.
that and I mean, it also explains, like, say, for example, why the boomers betrayed Greta Thunberg, because Greta Thunberg could have been an Age of Aquarian leader, but she made the error of introducing class struggle into her worldview, and
Yeah.
at that point, like, it wouldn't. Yeah. So there's like this liberal utopianism that's implicit in Adam Smith's idea of the theory of moral sentiments, is what I'm trying to say. That's like ultra idealist. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I definitely think so. And I think, it's like, I think this is what I'm talking about, right? Because like, and you see the same thing in Wealth of Nations, where I think, more ubiquitously or obviously to us, we see the mechanism of the invisible hand, right? It's through the selfishness of individuals, right? That the ends of God are kind of accomplished. But this is the point, and I think it is when we talk about this kind of moral shift, which we see within the European reception of Aladdin specifically, this is what it's kind of related to, right? Because it's incumbent upon individuals, right? To sort of fulfill the will of God in this way, which, I mean, I think Smith had some kind of Calvinist influence, right? But it raises all these questions about determinism and so forth, right? And we see the same kind of thing in Aladdin. Like in a sense, all of it's faded, right? He's the diamond in the rough, right? And yet, like, we still have a strong sense when we watch the film that, it's necessary for this agency to be manifested, right? So
Yeah,
there is a
that
problem. There
that
is a
but
problem with that.
that's the other thing that there is, and tell me if you think differently. Is there not an origin story that is basically a reproduction of something like the Horatio Alger myth within Aladdin himself, given that he comes from nothing and he's is he an orphan? Is
Well,
he sort of
in the original story, he's the son of a tailor, which is very
Taylor?
interesting. And in
Okay.
the
So
original
a
story,
lower class figure.
and
So
in the original story, by the way, he's exceptionally lazy, which is very interesting.
mm,
Like if you think of the way that he becomes the receptacle for these kind of great myths,
mhm,
right? It's
mhm.
like he can't fit into the economy of labor as it exists within that
Yeah,
context, not an economy
yeah.
of labor in the modern sense. Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I mean, and I think it's I think also what's interesting about the film is the way that when we get down to the resolution, right? Because and I think when part of this idea is that if Aladdin, can't actuate this inner transformation, which is also a transformation of Agrabah, right?
Right. Of course.
Right, because it's this movement beyond feudal patriarchal idyllic relations. If you can't actuate this, then this all turns into it's kind of a confidence trick, right? So you have a weird notion of like speculation and how it
Hmm.
works, right? Like it's okay for him to pretend to be Prince Ali as long as it's a vehicle for inner the expression of the authentic self, right? But it will fail if that can't happen. And so it's very interesting when Jafar actually exposes him in front of the princess, because um, he says, I love the exact words. He says, so Ali turns out to be merely Aladdin, just a con, need to go on, take it from me. His personality flaws, give me adequate cause to send him packing on a one-way trip, so his prospects take a terminal dip. His assets frozen, the venue chosen, it's the end of the earth, whoopee. So long, ex Prince Ali. Now, on one hand, we know that a villain's really evil when he sings the hero's song, or tauntingly reprises it. That's certain. Um, but but it's also very interesting the language, right? Like his assets frozen, in all of this, right? Kind of reinforcing this parallelism. But I think what's really interesting is at the end of the film, the way that Aladdin outsmarts Jafar, right? Um, because um, Jafar, of course, it turns into a cobra, right? Aladdin's trying to get the lamp; it's not working very well. And then he says to him, you know, uh, you'll never be as powerful as the genie, right? And then Jafar thinks, okay, and then he wishes himself to be this genie, right? And he's this sort of, you know, Kako demon who's juggling the cosmos on his hands, is bright red. But then of course the genie has to be imprisoned in the lamp. And I think this is very interesting, because it's like it's almost as if, it reminds me a little bit of Deleuze, right? In his analysis of fascism that we find, which is borrowed partly from Paul Virillo in Mille Plateaux, right? Because Deleuze talks about he makes the distinction between totalitarianism, which is about a kind of absolute control, and fascism. And one thing he says about fascism is that fascism, you know, it all it can do is kind of like continually generate crises, right, until it hits the point of collapse. And I feel that and you can see this historically, right? It's like, like the Nazis just create one crisis after another until they kind of find their terminus at Stalingrad, right? But I feel like we kind of see this with the with Jafar, right? He goes from one wish, bounding from kind of one wish to another. And in the process, I mentioned him being a sort of proto absolutist bourgeoisie in the sense,
Right.
right? In
Right.
the process, he kind of makes this.
But isn't
Uh,
it also, let's hold that thought, but isn't it also that Jafar is too bound up with feudal enjoyment and he doesn't understand proper austere Protestant restraint
oh,
that
absolutely.
Aladdin, right? So it's
Yeah, yeah.
which is tied to Oriental despotism, and there's a whole psychoanalytic thing there. Insofar as the Oriental despot is as the figure that must have a monopoly on jouissance, right? Which is tied into the notion of patriarchy and or sort of outdated form of patriarchy. So it becomes the politics of enjoyment in a certain way, which is why his wishes are not utilitarian and therefore not adequately capitalist.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
They're
absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
obscene.
yeah.
Like, yeah, his wishes can only be obscene. Yeah.
Yeah, I know, and
Whereas like
this
whereas
completely
like a good
conforms with.
like a good capitalist is like, yeah, in a way much more measured, selfless. It's very interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and then, no, this fits, right? Because like it's like, if you look at even the Nazis, if you look at like their primary, their sort of the sine qua non, right? Sort of the extermination of Jews. I mean, nothing could be more of like a hoary relic from the prejudices of feudalism, you know? And they turn this into sort of a litmus test of like, are you not, so this is so but in a way it's like, and I think it's funny, of course, because we know that, Jafar goes in the lamp and then he's brought out by someone else in the next film, The Return of Jafar, but that doesn't strengthen the allegory, right? Like, um, you know.
Right.
Um, but yeah, and then of course you have this kind of conclusion of the film, and you do have this sort of class synthesis that takes place, where Aladdin and Jasmine wed, and which is quite, and I consider the ending quite ambiguous in a sense, because at the end, there's a couple things that happen. I mean, one thing is that they talk about freeing the genie, right? Aladdin uses his last wish to free the genie, right? And it's actually interesting because the idea of freeing the genie, this came originally from a play adaptation of Aladdin in the 18th century, I think, by John Rich, and it was used as an allegory for abolitionism, right? Which is a super interesting
Oh wow.
fact.
Huh.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But it's also like, what would it mean to free capital,
Right.
right? And of course, like it could mean, that capital is sort of diffused everywhere, right? It could alternatively mean that you have uh, uh, sort of a society of working men producing together, right? That you have the abolition of capital as this kind of neurotic process of self-reproduction, right? That it becomes qualitatively different in this sense, right?
Yeah.
So I think there are different readings, and I also think it's very interesting. One of the last things we see as well is the genie has this aspiration to kind of travel around the world, right? He has his goofy hat on. He's gonna go everywhere. Um, and then at the beginning of the sequel, the direct-to-DVD sequel, where Robin Williams didn't voice the genie because he had this feud with Disney because they marketed his image contra his wishes. The genie returns, and he's like, "Oh, I just missed you all too much, to be gone." And actually, that's the last line in my essay is that capital travels around the world, only to stay in the same place.
Uh-huh.
That's
Yeah.
But I think it's also interesting because the beginning of the second movie, we see one of the first things we see is Aladdin sort of throwing wealth down to the
Yeah.
people, the poor people, right? Which is,
Right.
maybe also similar to our own post-war direct-to-DVD sequel to capitalism that we witnessed, even if it's less relevant now in our kind of neoliberal moment. Yeah, so there's a lot. And by the way, like if I were going through the film more comprehensively, I think it's also pretty important to talk about some of the important modernist films and rendition, like Corda's remake of The Thief of Baghdad. There's lots of them. I think those are interesting because like you see the genie sort of framed in another way. Like in those, it's almost about they often tap into the story of the ebony horse, but in those often it's about the need to like combat the deleterious impact of technology. um and so the Orient becomes like an allegory for a world that's untouched by alienation, right, in this odd way. And it's quite politically ambiguous. I mean, modernism has a lot of links with fascism and this kind of vector of authenticity,
Yeah, yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
But I also think by the time Disney made their own rendition, like whether we're talking about Basra, whether we're talking about Shenzhen, the places we associated with the Orient would be more likely to be industrialized in a lot of respects,
Right.
right? So they kind of rearrange the periodization. So what this zone of non-alienation just becomes the before, right? They show this kind of chronological shift, right, from feudal patriarchal idyllic relations to the arrival of the genie, which announces the profusion of postmodern capitalism, right? So yeah, that's pretty much what do you have any thoughts on that? Anything to say about that?
No, I mean I have many thoughts. I think that the Saidian periodizing of kind of European portrayals and representations of the Orient are fascinating in the sense that even if you look at like kind of like from the difference between the Western portrayals of the Islamic world pre 1979, post 1979, you see a pretty dramatic shift whereby in the 1970s, a lot of the initial kind of Arab nationalists was not actually kind of inspired by Islamism. It was actually
Yeah.
more like post-Leninist, secular socialist nationalist causes coming out of like
Well,
coming out of like
Yasser Arafat's
nationalism.
beard is from Castro and Che, right?
Right. But like, you had like the Black Hand taking over airliners as a kind of political act. But that was long before that became associated with Islamist ideology. And what I find interesting about the portrayal of Islam is that you also have something that our generation doesn't know or doesn't have any kind of palpable or tactile reference to, which is precisely this point that for many, many decades, the Orient was portrayed and the body of Muslims and Arabs were portrayed as like overly effeminate and overly sexualized, and
Mhm.
also like the whole sexual economy of the representation was fundamentally different pre-Islamism, pre 1979. And I think that in that shift, where you have that shift from secular nationalism inspired loosely by socialistic principles into
Mhm.
Islamism, you then see the return of something like Oriental despotism. You then see the return of a different sexual economy of representation, where the male figure, the male Arab, is either emasculated or portrayed as ultra masculine, but so masculine that their enjoyment becomes the problem, similar to Jafar's relationship to the genie. So
Yeah.
we've seen that shift. The other shift, of course,
Mhm.
is one that's even more nihilistic, whereby, and I think we still see this now playing out in what I mentioned at the beginning of our episode, in these kind of political Islamophobic discriminatory tropes, that Islam is a kind of death cult, or that
Mhm.
Islam is a kind of itself riven with an irrationalism which it cannot escape, and which is unique to it as a worldview, which is unique to it organically, right? And that has like a whole industry associated with it. What I find most interesting about that is that as the integration of Muslims generationally continues, like
Mhm.
millennial Muslims and Zoomer Muslims in the West, those narratives and tropes are losing their efficacy, which is, of course, good. It's very good that that's
Mhm.
happening. The Muslim community is going to face the same challenges that the Jewish community faced starting like in the 1940s, right? That just happened
Mhm.
for them several decades past, which is precisely this kind of integration secularization problem, which every religious community has to face.
Mhm.
But it's going to have a serious impact on the capacity for these, yeah, these kind of large scale otherizing campaigns, which may actually mean something positive for, like, for example, I would contend that Islamophobic tropes in the media gave a kind of superstructural legitimacy to the execution of the war in Iraq. I think with the genocide in Gaza, we also have to keep that very central. In other words, there is so much truth to the claim that one of the dynamics that allowed the genocide in Gaza to continue unabated, largely,
Mhm.
is this underbelly of this superstructural Islamophobic representational discourse, which still persists. It still persists. What I think we're seeing now with Cuomo versus Mamdani in New York is almost like something that perhaps may be a qualitative shift in that. I want your
Mhm.
take on that, actually. I wonder if you agree with that. I'm very hopeful that it would be. I'm not sure. I think that it falls into something like a kind of, the Fox News. I mean, like, it's very interesting that um, they can't get Mamdani on his economics of socialism,
Mhm.
but they can get him on the Islamic connection. That's very interesting to me, and I think that it's only to very particular demographics. And I'm seeing all of my, because I come from a background that is like half of my family is conservative Christians, right? And they resonate with that stuff. They resonate with the anti-Muslim stuff because I think it does terrify them,
Mhm.
you know.
Mhm.
And maybe for some people they don't understand that, because if you actually look at the polls, non-religious people are some of the most positive towards Muslims and Arabs than religious people. So it's actually like a religious discrimination issue that's
Mhm.
exploited and manipulated in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
So that's my thoughts on it, which is that Islamophilia used to be its own Islamophobia, and now we don't know anything about that in a certain way. Like, that's very distant from us.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, and I think it's interesting when you talk about the Gulf War, right? Because obviously Aladdin the film had a resonance. I understand that Agrabah in the film is an anagram of Baghdad, because originally they were going to call it Baghdad, but they kind of backed off because of some of the political events that were swirling around it. So, and of course, like inevitably, the subject of the Gulf War was brought up in a lot of the initial receptions. But I also want to say about Arabian Nights. I think one thing that's interesting is because we talked about this before about you know um, I mean, it's quite synergistic in a way because you see within more radical branches of Islam, you see often this sort of falsifying image of the past as kind of being monolithic in its religiosity that's diffused. But Arabian Nights is very interesting because religion kind of appears as at the limits of the text, right? It does have a kind of liminal existence within it. But these are also, in a sense, like surprisingly secular stories in a lot of ways, right? In other terms, not necessarily modern, but nevertheless surprisingly secular in certain respects. And we can easily observe a society in which people's primary interests appear to be, I don't know, money and getting babes or something. So I think it already contributes to dispelling some of that. And it's also an interesting text because it's written in a kind of Middle Arabic that might invite not classical and not completely vulgar or oratory that might invite certain interesting comparisons to Dante's Italian. So for that and many other reasons, the sci-fi elements, etc., it's a really interesting reference point for the idea of an Islamic modernity. But about your question, getting more down to your question about what's going on in the United States right now, um, I think there are a lot of different variables at play. I do think that Islamophobia of the stock type is really beginning to exhaust itself, and I think there are a lot of reasons for that. I think one is that there's been a relaxation in the diffusion of this kind of ideology in certain respects. Because of the diversion, there's the threat of Russia, there's the threat of China. I mean, NATO made this spectacular statement about Russia and China representing this existential threat to, I don't know, civilization as we know it or whatever. I don't know what language they used exactly. Surely something patronizing and culturally condescending. Um, but I think another factor that you really have to consider is like actually in quite a different climate than when the original Aladdin emerged, right? You mentioned that it's sort of been revised in its 2019 iteration. Um, but part of it, I think, is has to do with the tremendous, economic and social power that's also being accrued not just by states like, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, right? Dubai has become this go-to destination for influencers and all of this, I think a few days ago in Saudi Arabia, right, there was a big comedy event with, they had like Bill Burr and all kinds of seminal comedians, right? Dave Chappelle and other people were there. Um, and with sports and all that. So I think there's been a lot of soft power. Even we see it with the ascendancy of the cuisines in these regions, international level. But also, I think that Islamic migrants in a lot of Western countries, as they become more established, and of course, from a historical standpoint, there were plenty of Muslims all over Europe,
Yeah.
including Western Europe, though many of them were expelled or had genocide committed against them, in the consolidation of Europe as a kind of Christian homogeneous place. Again, not everywhere, right? It wouldn't be true of the Balkans, for example. But I think a lot of these migrant groups have had relative success. I mean, and it's very palpable in France, where for all the ethnic tensions, you have seen the integration of Muslims who are overwhelmingly North African or African in France and Paris. You've seen the integration of them into a lot of advanced professional sectors. Technology in France is, Algerians and so on played an enormous role, informatique, as they say. Uh, and again, you've had tensions, but you've also seen transformations in the representations.
Yep.
So if you go watch a movie like A Prophet from 2009, which I think was the first major French movie to have a majority North African cast with Tahir Rahim and Lil Bekti and so on. Yes, it portrays someone who is basically in a foster home and, they're kind of coerced into committing murder when they arrive in prison at the behest of, the local Corsicans who run the prison. But, when we watch the movie, we understand also that this person like was so socially destituted that they had really no choice to do this. And eventually, the protagonist begins to work with the Muslims in the prison who are the majority to overthrow, right, the
Yeah.
kind of Corsicans within it.
Well, I
Great
think
movie, by the way.
yeah. No, I think the
But
other.
I'm just saying you see a big shift in the representations, right?
I think that's right, and I would throw onto the table another reason for the shift in representation having to do with the fallout from the Arab Spring and the decline of political Islam, because political Islam sort of was for in the post 9/11 period up till about Bashar al-Assad's kind of genocidal campaign against his own people, right? Which marked, I think, a very dramatic shift in the whole trajectory that started really in Tunisia, then Egypt, and so on. Because implicit in those uprisings was the possibility of a new way for the Middle East to be ideologically orientated beyond
Mhm,
neoliberalism. But most effective administrators that were guided by the ideology of political Islam, namely the Brotherhood,
mhm,
had no economic alternative other than adherence to status quo. So therefore, political Islam kneecapped itself in a certain way. And I think
mhm,
Hamas stands as this sort of exception, which is a model that is so distinct to Palestine and Palestinians that it's very difficult for other Muslim nations to sort of mimic Hamas, because Hamas is
mhm.
so uniquely born from the apartheid condition that Israel imposes upon it. So I think another dimension here, because for a while it was unclear whether political Islam actually could have a life in power. And I think right now it doesn't seem as if that's the case. Instead, we have the kind of reconsolidation of the old status quo of these of really of the hegemony of the Gulf. And I mean, in my interview with Adam Hania, he said a very fascinating point apropos Saudi Arabia, which is Saudi Aramco still has 6 times the annual profit than all of the Western oil corporations combined. And so the age of fossil fuel dominance and Saudi centered, we often think that, oh, yeah, Saudi's going to be displaced. They're no longer the center of the oil economy. Adam Hani is like, that is a total myth, you know? So I think those dynamics are very accurate that you're pointing to. And they're affecting a kind of shift, which may, for many practicing Muslims, may be a positive shift insofar as integration into kind of neoliberal capital could would necessitate a de-discrimination of like Muslimness. But the cost of that is that the political dimension of Islam is kind of lost or forfeited or thrown out the window, you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, like, I think the question of kind of the integration into, more mainstream capitalist practices in these countries has a lot to do with, how resource wealth is diffused. I mean, one thing that was going on, that was strongly associated with the conditions under which Pan-Arabism collapsed, right, was that you had, countries like Saudi Arabia that were basically just, taking the resource wealth they were earning and just basically investing it in the United States, right, which is a way of ensuring a return, to just put it on that stock market. More recently, for obvious reasons, there's been a shift towards, trying to cultivate domestic productivity. But remember that part of the reason that these people were willing to throw the money onto the U.S. stock market, in addition to their own comparative ineptitude at times, and turning these into real ventures, was that it didn't challenge the internal social dispensation of these countries to that degree, right? The problem is when you start to actually use that as a basis to proletarianize, you're potentially grooming all kinds of social energies that can be subversive vis-a-vis the state. And indeed, we've witnessed, over the past few years, if you look at places like the Emirates, we've witnessed, a considerable liberalization of social norms, more or less forced because of the size of the foreign labor force that's being imported in these places.
Yeah.
And yet, like, there's still an attempt to kind of keep the lid on, right, in terms of avoiding like a policy that would allow people to
Yeah.
integrate themselves as citizens because of the financial benefits that may afford.
Well, that's why I actually think, in a related but slight divergence from what you're saying, I think it may be the case that the Mamdani campaign, on the event that he's successful and it looks as if he will be successful, may become better stewards of this kind of cultural, faith-based stabilization than what the neoliberal parties were capable of doing under Obamaism. precisely because a little touch of social democracy could be like the proper oil to lubricate a kind of improvement in civic relations, etc. Right? Which, of course, with like austerity and inflation at what it is, you would see, like Bismarck said, you have to sort of lube the social question. You have to give it a little bit of oil, otherwise the machine goes dry. And I feel that the neoliberal model is so hollowed out, is so dried out right now, right? So there may be a scenario in which social democrats, if the Democratic Party in the US permits them to actually hold power, which is still a kind of a question mark, we're not sure if that's going to happen, may actually become the stewards of a more robust sort of like civic fraternity, you know? And
Hmm.
that's very interesting for us, right? Insofar as civic fraternity, I think, is essential, right?
Hmm.
But what ends up happening in liberal political orientations, it becomes a fetish. It becomes an end in itself, and it bottoms out into something that inevitably becomes politicizing. And
Hmm.
then liberalism needs to turn people against each other on the basis of
Hmm.
identity, religion, and race. So I wonder what you think about that. Like, are you optimistic about what Mamdani might be able to do in terms of that type of, because like if you think about it, for all of the kind of economic catastrophes that Obama allowed to happen and all of the kind
Hmm.
of toothless basis of it, there was at the same time some degree of, cosmopolitan civic fraternity that Obamaism permitted, right? Dialectically, like that was a very short-lived thing. But to me, Mamdani kind of represents that, especially for the Jews of New York, who, after all of the horrors of everything in Gaza, are desperate for some type of rejuvenation. And rightly so. And they need that. And we all need that rejuvenation. There needs to be some transformation there. I think Mamdani may be actually able to inject some of that. Of course, its main limitation, and you may agree with this, is that it's like
Hmm.
a highly regional project, which kind of can't see the the class foundation upon which it's being supported, because I think that there is a kind of upper middle class support network that Mamdani is receiving precisely for the reasons I've just articulated. And therefore, the only way in which it could actually have legs would be if it's capable of injecting something that the system probably won't allow it to inject, which is more universal economic policies.
Yeah.
How
Hmm.
do you
Hmm.
see that playing out? And do you sort of agree that that may actually, in the short term, like infuse something that might kind of build the esprit de corps of not
Yeah.
only
Yeah.
of
Well,
New York, but maybe
it's
of
funny. It's
social
funny to
democracy?
me. It's funny to me because we have actually at our school here in China, we have I want to say he's a master's student, but his name's Austin Hicks from the South. And he wrote a blog post about, because he's very interested in kind of world systems theory and unequal exchange. And, he reads books by people like, Zach Cope, before he became a reactionary and so on and so forth, Amin and so on. And he wrote a blog post on Mamdani talking about how, the problem is that invariably New Yorkers are beneficiaries from unequal exchange in the world market, which is like at the risk of saying the obvious, I guess, right? But I thought it was kind of funny, but there is truth there. But getting onto the brass tacks of really the political questions. Um, no, I mean, I think that to me, like Momdani is it's so enigmatic in a way as a phenomenon. And I think it's something it's happening and we're all trying to read it and understand it. I found I'd have to review the statistics and I'd be interested in going over them in greater depth. But I found it fascinating that it seemed like tendentially a lot of the Mamdani supporters were higher income than Cuomo supporters. Of course, that doesn't mean that the foremost billionaires, in New York are necessarily supporting Mamdani en masse. And you do wonder as to the basis of that kind of demography. I mean, obviously, it would be easy enough to observe that at a sort of rhetorical level, there's a kind of compatibilism with a kind of woke messaging that's often associated with the kind of petit bourgeois standpoint within Mamdani's campaigns, for all its economic ideas, many of which are very meritorious. As to whether they can be actually be executed, especially with Trump breathing down his neck, that's another question. Um, but I also wonder to what extent it owes to the fact that conditions have become uh, you know in a relatively progressive environment like New York, and also one where so many people, even maybe a GP are squeezed in terms of things like homeownership, right? How generalized the consensus regarding the need for redistribution of wealth, within can become, right? To the point where you could have a lot of people who are even higher income supporting Mamdani. And it also makes me wonder how much this has become, a referendum on certain forms of ethnic politics in the city of New York, right? Because, if you're running in middle America, right, somewhere less demographically diverse, it's like the cultural dimension isn't going to have, the same kind of appeal. You're probably going to have to pitch more at what we might term kind of class interests. And that way,
Yeah,
and this partly explains, the nascent success of Sanders in some of those regions, even if he was ultimately unable to break out of this
right.
more cultural framework.
I would argue that Sanders would do worse in New York than Mamdani, because
Mhm,
Mamdani,
mhm.
by his very existence, solves the problem of Sanders, which is that Sanders introduces a race problem, which for the kind of upper middle class mindset tends to be um, like Mamdani challenges them, but they're willing to be challenged by him because he already embodies, like, it's like speaking of Disney, it's very interesting that we had this whole episode on Disney because Mamdani was actually trained by Disney in public speaking. I don't know if you knew that.
I love America.
Did you know that? Did you know
No, I
that?
didn't know that. No.
Yeah. No, he's like a like professionally trained by the greatest people in like film and television,
Oh,
which is
really?
why like he's like, yeah, he's like inbuilt organically charismatic figure, of course, but he also has like serious training in how to be in front of a camera, how to communicate, etc. Right. So I would argue that Mamdani, he circumvents the identity politics people, for which that's how they construe politics to begin with, right?
Yeah, yeah,
They're
yeah,
already, that's like already their kind of like sunk concern. So he sort of neutralizes that. But
yeah.
if you had like a Sanders figure, Sanders's message is already like hostile to that, so they're going to be made uncomfortable by him. So, anyways, so I think you're
Well,
right.
you need a different candidate. For and I do think Mamdani is fair. But this is why I wonder, by the way, about, and again, I'd have to reread it. I don't claim to have some
Yeah,
total I haven't written on this, right? But I would have to look over the stats again. But I do think it's interesting because one thing that's true of a place like New York, I mean, New York, one of the most multicultural cities in the world, alongside Toronto and a handful of others. And one thing about New York is that, you know, um, Mamdani, particularly, as someone, coming from a demographic that's associated with immigration and that's eligible to win the support of people in those communities. I mean, in the United States, um, to become a legal immigrant with the right to vote, right, is very hard, right? Even today, I mean, Trump has put a bit of a chill on immigration application, but even today, there's so many more people that want to come to the United States, and New York in particular, which is harder to go to because it's expensive. Um, that we know that the immigration system is very, very discriminating, in terms of what's your level of education, right? What kind of capital are you bringing on the front end, right? So, this is to say that, if something begins to function a little bit more as an ethnic referendum or a referendum on those kind of politics in New York, if people are drawing lines in that way, of course, there's going to be a lot of people who, are tremendously well educated, who are tremendously affluent, right? Who are going to favor Mamdani because, while if we were to talk about quote minorities in general, it would be a slightly different picture. The reality of immigration in New York City. I'm not saying everyone's rich and doing really well, but there is tremendously socially mobile people within those
absolutely.
communities.
Well, it's not,
Um,
and it's also true that Cuomo brings and has more support in the Bronx and outside of Manhattan from lower um, yeah, from the working class constituency, much of which is African American. This has sort of been well documented. We're going to have to see how that plays out and if it remains consistent. I think the reasons for that are pretty clear regarding like habitus and media consumptions, right? So like the fact of the matter is that Mamdani's campaign was only able to sort of flourish and exchange its messaging within a PMC bubble, which is fine.
Mhm,
But
mhm,
Cuomo is capable through corporate media channels to pump the poor with messages.
mhm,
That's
mhm.
the main reason I would attribute that to. I wouldn't overanalyze that fact as if to say that like poor blacks like neoliberal policies. I think this is absurd.
Yeah, yeah,
Do
yeah,
you know
yeah,
what I mean? This is absurd.
yeah.
It's the same thing as like I had my wife's uh, my mother-in-law in town, and she's an elderly conservative Christian, and some of the things that she was just like blurting out about Israel and stuff was so clear that she's getting advertisements from APAC on Facebook, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
that she's repeating. And that's really all it is. It's really all it is. And but those things are effective. Those things are extremely effective. But
Well, I think about this, and I want to say, to me, Mamdani is such a question mark to me at this stage, because I think if I have to say, like, what is most likely? So I understand there are aspects of Mamdani's message and his campaign which are genuinely representative of a new radicalism in American politics. Or renewed radicalism, maybe considering the kind of depression of the fortunes of left populism over the past few years. Um, but I think the real problem is that right now, like, there's really no national conduit or any kind of wide popular conduit for that. I mean, New York obviously is a slightly different ballgame. But we see it with AOC's capitulation over a number of key issues, right, including fairly dubious positions indeed on Israel. So she's kind of gone in for collaboration with the Democratic establishment because evidently she doesn't believe that this sort of activist DSA position is sufficient to guarantee her a long-term political career.
that's
And
true. That's true. Although at his recent rally, where there was over 10,000 people that came out, they were chanting DSA, 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 and AOC and Bernie were there, and so on. So you could have a situation in which, um, yes, these new candidates would kind of enter into the kind of assembly line of the Democrats, and we would see this kind of cascade downward of their inclusion and then their eventual pacification. And I think as socialists, we should expect that. I don't think that we should be promoting this idea that, oh, maybe Graham Plattner and Zora Mamdani will be different. No, I think we should actually expect them to do that because they're conditioned by the party. And I think it would be quite naive for us. At the same time, we should kind of keep a little bit of distance to it because there are some contingencies that may happen. I don't know if that they're going to happen. The main one being the fact that the Democrats could actually have certain like structural fatal weaknesses in
Mhm.
which we could see some kind of left takeover of their party. Highly
Well, I don't.
doubt.
I don't even. By the way, I don't even see it as being about at this point. I don't even see it as predominantly being about the weakness of the Democrats. Like, I think that ship potentially sailed a few years ago. Of course, like the neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party lacks, like, a lot of enthusiastic popular support. I think this is very well known. At the same time, I think that they're profiting enormously from, the mantra of just oppose Trump. We see these people like Gavin Newsom, who is, horrible in many respects, right? Being held up as this potential agent of resistance. But I do think that right now, like, Trump has a really difficult situation on his hands, right? And maybe along the lines of what we were saying earlier about this fascistic impulse, and this sort of suicidal trajectory. Because he just keeps creating one crisis after another. And he's now in a position where he's in a three-front war, basically against, domestic liberals, his own party, and, or mega, and the international community. And in a sense, though all of those obviously, I mean, the one contra liberals is just his bread and butter. While the battle with his base is perilous indeed, I think the one that's most damaging right now is the battle with the international community. And the specific reason for that is because of the price hikes that it's contributing to. and the possibility of even further ones, and the way that that can alienate people who otherwise just don't have much of an investment in these overall issues. I mean, I'm looking at social media now, and not, left bubble stuff. I'm looking at, funny stories about Trump that people on Instagram are commenting on. I guess they're maybe a little younger, so there might be a bias there. But I've been stunned to see the enormous turn of Americans, the level of negativity regarding Trump's policies right now. So who knows? Maybe he'll just like start a war to get out of it. Like, I don't think that we can underestimate the extremes that Trump will go to save himself, from political collapse. And I give, for example, he didn't adopt an establishment position towards COVID. Not that the establishment position was ideal, but it was better than his. But he didn't adopt an establishment position of COVID to maintain this oppositional posture vis-a-vis the status quo. Even as you have what, like a million Americans died, then they stopped counting. I'm not really sure, but mass death in any case occurred, right? And that was something he was willing to do, potentially even to risk losing an election in order to maintain the continuity of his political brand, right? So these are quite serious things. So I don't think that we can eliminate the possibility that Trump may start a war or something. I think you saw with um, in his conversation with the president of Ukraine. He said, well, you start a war and then you don't have to have election. So we don't know exactly, but if the Republicans go, it's still possible. If the Republicans are facing a historical loss,
Yeah,
right?
in the
Like if they
midterm.
get and people saying, like, if we say 25%, people might say, well, that's not possible.
Right.
But like, we're in uncharted territory right now. People don't get this. Like, this is not a normal situation. No normal Republican president would, tariff or threaten to tariff
Well, I
the
mean,
entire world this way.
but the thing is, though, is that every capitalist ruling party, once in power, once they have a majority in both the House and the Senate, have reproduced the same dynamic of extreme unpopularity, which of course points to a systemic crisis. Um, and which, of course, also points to the fact that if social democrats were to assume that mantle, I don't see a path for them to that. But if they did, they too would go through the same oscillation of a profound dejection because the system is in a chronic crisis and so on. So it's like that. That is true. I think you make a good point. I mean, about Trump's brand and the preservation of that brand. I'm not sure that I agree that it's going to be war with Iran or in Russia,
Yeah.
especially because of his curtailment of Netanyahu, which is, of course, yeah, thank God for it. I mean, in a certain way. I mean, thank God
Yeah.
that has
Yeah.
happened.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, we'll follow the situation very closely, and I think that Trump could very well obstruct Mamdani, and he probably will in certain way. Um, so I'm cautiously optimistic about the
Well,
Mamdani
so
moment.
here's my thing about this. It's like, and by the way, I think, in my personal estimation, I think China is more likely to. I don't think he wants to be involved in the Middle East. I think he wants to hand off the baton to his affluent Arabic allies. And the United States has engaged strategically in the region to assist Israel,
Yeah,
but I think it's quite clear they're not too enthusiastic about deepening commitments, which is not to undermine like how much they've done already.
it seems that the
But
new front is South America, beginning with the meddling in Venezuela, evidenced by the fact that they're considering moving CIA operations from China there back to South
yeah.
America. So
Mhm.
I mean, but again,
Well,
I'm
but
not
what I mean,
sure.
what I mean about this is like, all I want to say is like, but if the Republicans experience a colossal collapse, like a collapse down to like 25% of their vote or something,
Yeah,
then this opens the door for like, an independent run by a socialist candidate, for instance, that's far more successful than what we've seen in recent history. And in that context, something like Mamdaniism could actually have, a more radical national conduit to sort of interface with.
mm,
But this is the thing, like, if Mamdani in New York becomes, because like, he's going to be obstructed by Trump, we know this, right? He's
yeah,
going to be obstructed by the bourgeoisie of New York, there's no doubt. So it would only be logical politically for him to position himself as a kind of opposition, to these social energies.
yeah.
Because like, he has to understand that like all you can do now is really fight, right? You can't just do these things, right? So really, you have to, like, you don't have the organization to accomplish it. So you have to try to achieve some kind of organization to actually get these things done. But then the question is, how does that translate over to a national register? And I think again, like it's probable that it's just kind of neutered, right, in that process of transmission. But I also, given how erratic the American political system is now, I think we can't dismiss the possibility of other outcomes.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I want to thank you, Conrad, for coming on to educate us regarding the political economy of Aladdin. And yeah, I mean, it reminds me a bit, by the way, your analysis of Allegory and Ideology by Jameson, because you really followed the allegory far.
Hmm.
And it was very like you got a lot out of it by your reading of the cartoon was almost like literal at times, but in that literal reading, uh you pulled out some nuggets that are quite, because it's very interesting, because the intentionality of the writers obviously is not like forged in this reflection at all, but you're imposing this allegory onto it, which fits so nicely that it's
Hmm.
almost uncanny. Frankly, it's a little uncanny how
Well,
nicely it fits.
they know not what they do,
They know not what
right?
they
That's
do.
the
Yeah.
No, but it's actually funny because, by the way, and I'll leave you on this one in terms of Aladdin, but it's funny because because I talked about Friend Like Me being this sort of paean to the powers of capital, to transform social reality, the song. And in the Will Smith version, he says, um, everything can be rearranged, or he sings, everything can be rearranged, even climate can change. And I, it's like they don't know what they're doing, but they do.
That's amazing. Yeah, 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 yeah. I love it. I absolutely love it, man. Well, thank you so much, guys, for listening. Please support us on Patreon, and we'll be back soon. I know we need to do it more frequently. We said initially it was once a month, but sometimes it takes us like 2-3 months to get one of these out. So, Conrad, is it okay if we stick more to this, monthly schedule?
You're putting me on the spot. You're asking me in recording. Yeah,
I'm
yeah. No,
I'm
I'll try
I'm
to.
putting you on the spot.
Putting me on the spot. I'll try to do it. And we should do another reading group at some time. And it would be good to
Yes.
lots of books are interesting, but it might be good to look at Reading Capital sometime too, the complete edition. Because
Okay.
I have to confess that in my studies I read through the Althusser Balibar, so I've never gone through in detail the other
Okay.
essays.
Okay. That's a very
So
good
that could be
idea.
very interesting. Yeah.
Well, we also vote on these things, which you can learn about when you join the Patreon. And
Hmm.
okay, until
But
next time.
you're like Brecht, right? You can dissolve the people and choose another one. Right? No, he can't do that. He's a real Democrat. Don't worry.
I am actually. Okay, all the best, guys. Take care.
So.